I made a promise when we started this summer. I promised you that even though week in and week out, you would come to our gatherings on Sundays, and that I know that in our minds, we'd rather be like on a beach somewhere with our toes in the sand, things like that, that I would do my part, that we would do our part on our end to make sure that we brought some water into your gathering so you didn't feel so far away from home. And so we've been in a summer series, Foundation Summer, where every single week the message has revolved around water. And today is no different. We're going to be hanging out by the Sea of Galilee once again. Now, when we first kind of had this idea, I was like, I don't know if we can do 10 full weeks, or really 10 water messages in the life of Jesus. I'm not really sure, like off the top of my head. And so we started looking, and it turns out that Jesus hung out by the lake a lot. So if you know Jesus, I don't know what he would have driven, probably a Ford F-150. And when he did, he would have had Lake Life on the back. I think that's what he would have had. He would have one of the Lake Life stickers. I think that's what we have. That's our setting for today's message. We're going to be hanging out in the book of John. The book of John. It's a pretty fascinating book. It's one of the most fascinating books for me because it's so different than the other Gospels. When we say the word gospel, it's just a fancy church word for the first 4 books of the New Testament. The New Testament chronicles the life of Jesus. And Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, those 4 books we call the Gospels, or another common day term is just to say it's the good news. It tells us exactly who Jesus is and why it's good that he came. And so in that 4th gospel, in the book of John, there's a story that I want to kind of dive into. I mentioned our setting with the Sea of Galilee, and I need to make a correction. I was corrected this week, and it feels really good when someone calls you and says, hey, you're wrong. Not only are you were wrong a bunch. And that happened to me this week, so I have to confess. This is actually good. It means that people are actually paying attention. So for the last few weeks, in my little rant about where the Sea of Galilee is, I go on this whole thing. I say, hey, it's 13 miles long, 7 miles wide. It's in this basin surrounded by mountains. It sucks air in from the Mediterranean Sea. That's what causes all these storms. But over and over and over again, I've said it's 9,000 feet below sea level. And that's just not true. It's just a lie. It's just not true. In my notes, I was writing, and I needed to correct this. So I need to make sure I'm right here. In my notes, I just wrote it's 9,000 feet below, and I just stopped. And so in my mind, as I'm reading my notes up here, I'm like, that must have meant below sea level. And then I got a call or a text message or a Facebook message. I don't remember which one it was. Thanks, Andy. And Andy called me, or called whatever he did to me, and he said, hey, here's the deal. I looked it up, and I was thinking that was a weird number, and sure enough, it was. It's actually not even close to thousands of feet below sea level. The note was it's in a 9,000-foot deep basin that the mountains around it stretch to about 9,000 feet. So completely different. I know it changes everything, but I wanted to make sure that I was being honest with you and not just continuing to lie on to you. Over and over again. I thought about just slipping in the real elevation and maybe you wouldn't notice, but then I thought Andy would notice and maybe he'd put it on social media and say, hey, here my preacher, he contradicts himself. I just didn't want to chance that. So that's where we're at. Sea of Galilee, not 9,000 feet below sea level, but in a basin surrounded by mountains at the bottom, about 9,000 feet from the peaks. Here we go. In terms of time, we are post-crucifixion. And so Jesus has hung on the cross. He has passed away on the cross. They've taken his body. They've put him in a tomb. Easter Sunday has come. He is resurrected from the grave. And that's where we find ourselves. The people that are going to be in this story, there's a guy named Jesus. You might have heard of him. There's another guy named Peter, which we talked about last week. He has another name, Cephas, right? Simon. All of those 3 interchangeable. His name's Peter. We have a guy named John who wrote this book that we're actually reading out of. And then there were other disciples. We're going to get into that in just a second. The thing I'm going to read a piece of the story to you. It's actually broken up into 2 parts. An encounter with Jesus, and then there's an encounter with the Son of God. And so we want to make sure that we differentiate those 2 encounters. And the first little section that I'm going to read you, I just want you to watch for Peter being Peter. And that's all I'm going to say. Just Peter being Peter. John chapter 21, verse 1. We'll put it on the screen for you, but it reads this way. After this, Jesus appeared to his disciples again. Disciples is just a fancy word for friends. It was by the Sea of Galilee. Here is what happened. Simon Peter and Thomas, who was also called Didymus. I don't know if you noticed, but Didymus, P. Diddy thinks he was the first Diddy, but he wasn't the first Diddy. I don't know if you noticed that, but I just want to point that out. Thomas, who was also called Didymus, were there together. Nathanael from Cana in Galilee and the sons of Zebedee were with him. So a bunch of people. So were two other disciples. Oh, they don't get named. I'm going out to fish, Simon Peter told them. They said, well, we'll go with you. So they went out and got into the boat. That night, they didn't catch anything. Does that sound familiar if you were here a couple weeks ago? Another catchless night. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize it was Jesus. He called out to them, friends, don't you have any fish? He knew the answer. No, they answered. He said, well, just throw your net on the right side of the boat. There you will find some fish. When they did, they could not pull the net into the boat. There were too many fish in it. Then the disciple Jesus loved said to Simon Peter, it is the Lord. As soon as Peter heard that, he put his coat on. He had taken it off earlier. Then he jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat. They were towing the net full of fish. The shore was only about 100 yards away. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals. There were fish on it. There was also some bread. Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish you have just caught. So Simon Peter climbed back into the boat. He dragged the net to shore. It was full of large fish. There were 153 of them. But even with that many fish, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, come and have breakfast. None of the disciples dared ask him, who are you? They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, took the bread, and gave it to them. He did the same thing with the fish. This was the third time Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. The first thing I want to point out is that sometimes you get into this apologetics or this defense for faith. And some people might say, well, maybe Jesus was a real person. Maybe Jesus was a real person, and maybe he did die on the cross. However, the chances of him having a physical body-like resurrection, a bodily resurrection, that's just too much for me to handle. All of those accounts are probably just spirits. Jesus was just a spirit hanging out and around. I'd like to point out that Jesus is eating fish. I don't know if you've seen the movie Casper, but when those folks eat it, it just falls. You know what I'm talking about? They eat it and it just falls everywhere. I would think John would have mentioned that if Jesus was eating fish and it was just falling out everywhere like in the movie Casper. But that's not what's happening. So Jesus is eating fish here, hanging out on the beach. I think it's interesting that this is the second time that the disciples have been in a boat fishing all night. They're professional fishermen and they've come back with nothing. The first time that it happened, Jesus used it as an opportunity to teach them something. This time he will do the same thing. Isn't it interesting that Jesus chooses to use their failures to teach them some of the most valuable things in their lives? I wonder if the same could be said of us. I wonder if there are moments as we're going throughout our lives and we recognize, you know what? We just struck out. Things have not occurred the way we wanted them to occur. We are losing. Things are not going our way. I wonder if we have the courage to say, well, what are you teaching us? You notice that Jesus just said, well, the reason you didn't catch any fish is because you're throwing the nets on the wrong side of the boat. I don't know if there was an invisible force field under the boat, and on the left side, the fish couldn't get there. I'm not sure. But once he threw it on the right side of the boat, it said all the fish came in the nets, 153 of them. You might be saying, hold on, whoa. How did they count them? These are professional fishermen. They were going to sell these fish. That's why they counted them. They probably even divvied them up among one another to distribute the profits to their families. That's the way these people worked, right? They were fishermen. Their method, you might think, well, it was really close to what Jesus said. They just threw the nets on the left. He said, throw the nets on the right. It was so close. I wonder if in life, as we're kind of going about our life, if we ever convince ourselves that, well, Jesus has asked me to live a life this way, but I'm going to instead choose to live a life, it's really close. It resembles it a lot, but I'm just going to go a hair to the left, right? Or hair to the right, just a little bit off of where Jesus has asked us to be. And maybe we even make that excuse and say, well, no, but we are really close. We are really close to exactly what Jesus wants. You know, I don't necessarily think that some of those things we do in our lives are all that terrible. In fact, I think there are times when we do things that aren't the way Jesus would do them, and it's not that it's bad, it's just different. But here is the truth. It's not always that our ways are wrong, or it's not that our ways are always wrong. It's simply that Jesus' ways are always better. That's the truth. It's not that our ways are always wrong. It's simply that Jesus' ways are always better. If you have to choose with something specific in your life, and you get to choose, can I do it my way or my family's way, or my aunt's way or my uncle's way or my dad's way, grandpa's way, my wife's way, my husband's way? If you have to choose and you get the choice, I can do it their way or I know that I can do it Jesus' way. If you get to choose the better way. It doesn't devalue the person who gave you the advice. It doesn't mean that the advice that they gave you was wrong or stupid or just unvaluable. It just meant that it wasn't Jesus' advice. That's all that it means. And so you shouldn't get so caught up in, well, maybe I want to be respectful. I don't know. If Jesus asked you to do something, I would be more scared of disrespecting him than simply going back to the person saying, you know what, I think I'm going to try it this other way. Now, here's the truth. When Jesus tells us to do some things, it's very possible that the things he tells us to do are not going to make a lot of sense to us. I admire the disciples in this moment because he just says, well, just throw the fish on the other side of the boat. And they did it. Like they didn't talk back to him. They didn't say, hey, what do you know about fishing? They just simply did it. What are the situations in our lives right now that we're working through and we seem to be making no progress? Could it be that you haven't tried Jesus' way yet? Is it possible? Or maybe you're saying, well, I don't even know what Jesus' way is. How do I figure that out? How do I figure out what Jesus wants me to do? That's complicated. Because each one of you are individuals and your life is complex. No one's life is simple. It has a series of baggage and experience that all put together in one create who God has made you to be in this life. Your failures have taught you, and some failures have been ignored. And you put all of those together, and that's where you found yourself. And that's okay. It's okay to not be right. It's okay to be in a place where you don't have things all figured out. It's okay to be at your wit's end. It's okay to be exhausted. It's okay to be frustrated. It's okay to say, you know what, I think I want to give up. Those are all okay. But now that you're being confronted this morning with, there could be a possibility that Jesus' way will bring relief. If you don't want to try it, then we start stepping into, well, maybe that is foolish. If you've tried everything and you can't seem to fix it, why not try Jesus? Why not sell out to him and follow the specific details in your life? Why not sell out to him and just say, I'm going to do it completely your way? That's what the disciples did here. It worked for them. Unfortunately, in this example, it worked like that for them. And the reality is this is just a small picture of a story that happened in a brief moment in time between Jesus and his friends. The reality is there were many other times where Jesus asked them to do something and there wasn't an immediate fix or solution that showed itself. They just had to be resolute in their obedience and know that Jesus always wins. I find it interesting. This is just comic relief for me. Specifically in verse 7, it says Peter puts on his coat. In the NIV, it actually translates it as coat. But if you look deep into the language, specifically, it's a phrase that's represented there in the original language. That phrase is represented by gimos or gymnos. And it means he was naked. And so I don't know if they've just PG'd this in the English language, but I just picture Peter just like burly fisherman, just like killer fisherman, just like naked, hanging out on the boat. He said, oh, that's Jesus. I should probably put something on. I don't know that's for sure. That's just what literally the text says in the original language, that he was naked, for he was naked, right? Well, he puts it back on to swim back to shore, and he's about 100 yards off. So obviously Peter's a pretty decent swimmer because he beats the boat back. Now they're towing a bunch of fish, but still, I don't know if any of you want to just jump in the water and make a 100-yard swim. 100 yards is a long way. It's like a football field. I don't know if y'all knew that or not, but it's a long ways. It's a long ways to swim. And then he gets to have breakfast with Jesus. Who wants to have breakfast with Jesus? How cool is this? It's incredibly rare, right? Like Jesus didn't have children, right? He didn't have children, so we can't get connected to him that way. It's difficult. Like no one has like Jesus's clothes hanging around so people can go try it on and like run around in it and feel kind of connected to Jesus. How cool is it that they ate food that Jesus made? If you're a chef or you're a cook in the room, I mean, how good must that fish have been? I mean, like the Son of God grilled out some fish on a beach. I'm just thinking you open a restaurant right then, like catch of the day. I don't know what you call it. An encounter with Jesus. Jesus was very human. He understood the needs of his human friends. He said, hey, you're coming in empty-handed. Let me help you with that. He said, you're hungry. Let me cook breakfast for you. I told you this is split up into two different pieces. The first piece is just really an intro. The second piece really gets into the meat of it because the first one is an encounter with Jesus. Jesus is very human. But the second part of the story is an encounter with the Son of God. And Jesus very quickly makes a switch. He understands that he meets their physical needs, but he recognizes and wants them to recognize that there's something more, something bigger, something beyond what they could see that he was expecting out of them. I'll read it to you. It continues still in that very same book of John, very same chapter. The very next verse is verse 15. We'll put it on the screen as well. So when Jesus and the disciples had finished eating, Jesus spoke to Simon Peter. He asked, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these others do? Yes, Lord, he answered. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my lambs. Again, Jesus asked, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said, take care of my sheep. Jesus spoke to him a third time. He asked, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter felt bad because Jesus had asked him the third time, do you love me? And he answered, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my sheep. What I'm about to tell you is true. When you were younger, you dressed yourself. You went wherever you wanted to go. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands. Someone else will dress you. Someone else will lead you where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to point out how Peter would die. His death would bring glory to God. Then Jesus said to him, follow me. Man, that turned pretty quick. Can you imagine what it's like to be in a group of guys that have been friends for years, and they just had one of the largest catch of fish that they had ever had together, and they're celebrating, and Jesus is the cook. He's the grill master. He's making things happen on the beach. And they're cutting up and they're laughing. It says, after they finished eating, Jesus turns to Simon Peter and begins to ask him the same question 3 different times. This is a difficult thing for Peter to hear because Peter understands the context of the relationship that he now sits in with Jesus, who's also the Son of God. You see, there was a scene that unfolds prior to this that we have to link together. There's a little bit of puzzle piecing together that we're going to have to do this morning. But I think as we do it, the vision of what Jesus wants to accomplish will unfold itself in a way that's incredibly clear. You see, there was a moment prior to this gathering where Jesus and Peter had a conversation. That conversation led to this encounter. Jesus, we're going to backtrack in history or a little bit, just rewind the tape, not too much in history, just a few weeks before this breakfast on the beach happened. There's a place where Simon Peter has an encounter as Jesus has been arrested. He's going through a series of trials in the middle of the night. He's about to be crucified, and the followers of Jesus, his friends, are kind of following him around, staying at a safe distance. We'll see it here in John chapter 18. It says this: Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. The high priest knew the other disciple, so that disciple went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. But Peter had to wait outside by the door. The other disciple came back. He was the one the high priest knew. He spoke to the servant woman who was on duty there. Then he brought Peter in. So what's happening, there's one guy, the high priest kind of knew, they knew, so he went on in. Once he figured out the lay of the land, he went back to bring Peter in, right? He said, hey, he's with me, he should come in, right? She asked Peter, you aren't one of Jesus' disciples too, are you? And he said, I am not. I am not, he replied. It was cold. The slaves and officials stood around a fire. They had made it to keep warm. Peter was also standing with them. He was warming himself. We'll skip down to verse 25 to pick it up where Peter comes back in the story. Meanwhile, Simon Peter was still standing there warming himself by the fire. So they asked him, you aren't one of Jesus' disciples too, are you? And he said, I'm not. One of the high priest's slaves was a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off. Peter got in a little scuffle where he cut off an ear. I don't know if that's a little scuffle, but that when they came to get Jesus, he was a little pissy about it. And so he pulled out a sword and he cut the man's ear off. And Jesus put it back, so it was fine. But that's what's happening here. that's what's happening here. It says, one of the high priest's slaves was a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off. He said to Peter, didn't I see you with Jesus in the garden? Again, Peter said no. At that exact moment, a rooster began to crow. Man, betrayal hurts, doesn't it? I tell you what's worse. What's worse than that is that Jesus told Peter ahead of time that he was going to betray him. And notice Jesus asks Peter 3 times, do you love me? Notice that Peter denies Jesus 3 times. In this picture we'll reverse just a little bit more, even before Peter has this denial time. And it's late one evening, and Jesus is having his last supper with his followers and his friends. And he has this. It's found in the book of Matthew, chapter 26. It says this: Jesus told them, this very night you will all turn away because of me. So Jesus knows he's about to get arrested. He knows he's going to the cross. And so he looks at his friends and says, this very night you will all turn away because of me. It is written that the Lord said, I will strike the shepherd down, then the sheep of the flock will be scattered. That's important. Let's remember that. I will strike the shepherd down, then the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I rise from the dead, I will go ahead of you into Galilee. Peter replied, all the others may turn away because of you, but I never will. What I'm about to tell you is true, Jesus answered. It will happen tonight. Before the rooster crows, you will say 3 times that you don't know me. But Peter said, I may have to die with you, but I will never say I don't know you. And all the other disciples said the same thing. I mean, it's just hours later that Peter's standing by that fire pit. Peter standing by the door when those people begin to ask him, do you know Jesus? He says, no, I don't. When he heard the rooster crow, I bet immediately he popped back into, what have I done? You see, Jesus and Peter hadn't had many interactions. This was only the 3rd time that Jesus had seen his disciples when he shows up on the beach to cook breakfast after that large catch of fish that miraculously happened. And so I find it even more interesting that there hasn't been a time that we, at least is recorded in the Bible, where Jesus and Peter make amends. Where Peter comes to him and says, you know what, you were right. My bad. I know I kind of probably yelled in front of everybody and said, no, you're wrong. And then Jesus says, what I tell you is true. And then I told you, Jesus, you're wrong again. That's just weird. When you look at the Son of God or God, when you sit there and say, you know what, I just think you're wrong. By definition, you're getting rid of any kind of God tag you put on there. God can't be wrong. And so when you say to him, hey, you're wrong, By definition, you're stripping him of that. You're saying, you know what? Who you are at your core is not true. That's a dangerous thing to say to someone who created the world with words. And so Peter and Jesus are reunited on this beach. And Jesus wants to make sure that he makes the most of the opportunity that he has with Peter, because he knows the opportunity are going to be few and far between from here on out. You notice that when Jesus asks a question, Peter responds with words, and then Jesus backs up his response with the request for action. Did you notice that? When Jesus says, Peter, do you love me? He says, yes, you know I love you. Well, feed my sheep. Peter, do you love me? Yes, you know I love you. Take care of my lambs. Peter, do you love me? Lord, you know all things. You know I love you. Feed my sheep. It's like Jesus is telling him that words at the end of the day are just empty and meaningless. Show me that you love me. If that's really how you feel. Because remember, Peter has been resolute with words before. He looked at Jesus and said, no, there's no chance I'm going to deny you. There's no chance I'm going to say I don't know you. There's no chance I'm going to turn away. And so as Jesus is saying, do you love me? And Peter's saying, yes, I love you. And Jesus is saying, that's not good enough. I've heard words before, but show me something. The thing is, when words are connected to action, it becomes reality for us. When words are empty, it just becomes an imagination, possibly a daydream. Ultimately, depending on how many people you hurt with your empty words, maybe a nightmare. Empty words are dangerous. Jesus recognizes just how dangerous these will be. In fact, he actually quotes, as he's having a conversation about them denying him, he says this, I told you to remember this, I will strike the shepherd down, then the sheep of the flock will be scattered. And so Jesus is saying, look, this is what's at stake. If you can't actually love me, if you can't show me, it's going to require you to take care of my sheep, which are now scattered, to feed my sheep, which are now scattered. What's the responsibility of a shepherd? To feed them, to take care of them. That's his job. And so he's looking at Peter and he's saying, look, I'm about to be struck. I'm about out of here, right? I'm going to need you to step up. Jesus knew what was kind of relying on Peter's ability to love him with more than words. You see, following Jesus doesn't mean saying Jesus things. Following Jesus doesn't mean feeling Jesus things. Following Jesus means that we do what he asks. It really is that simple. Following Jesus means that we do what he asks. Ultimately, in the first century, when they would use that phrase, and your hands will be stretched out, when they use that phrase, that alludes to crucifixion. The Romans used crucifixion as a torture and shaming device in public. Jesus says, not only am I going to give you some responsibilities of taking care of my sheep, it's going to come at a cost. It will cost you your life. You see, sacrifices had to be made so that the church at that time could flourish. Jesus understood. Jesus understood what was coming. Jesus understood exactly what Peter was getting himself into. I have to ask the question then today, if Peter is a part of the launch of the church, and he recognizes that sacrifices must be made so that the church could flourish, the question becomes, what are we sacrificing? For those of you who have loved Jesus a long time, and you have a relationship with Jesus a long time, what are you sacrificing? Our church exists to lead to Jesus, to make disciples, and to unleash the kingdom of God into our community. You know what inhibits, you know what stops, puts up barriers from those three things happening? People who love Jesus, but also love traditions they can't let go of. When people who love Jesus, and they've loved Jesus for a long time, they start saying, hey, things have got to be my way and this way and this way. And when that begins to happen, man, church is done for. It becomes a building where people sing songs and they study the Bible. And that's good for nobody. It certainly is no good for our community. Because at the end of the day, Jesus is showing us it's not enough just to say, love you, God. You know I love you. Because God's looking back on our church and he's saying, feed my sheep. Take care of my lambs. He's given us a community to go out and make a difference in his name with. And so we can't get stuck on silly small things like where we sit or the style of music we play. Thankfully, we don't have those issues here at Foundation. And we're not going to have those issues here at Foundation. Because our priority and our preferences are always geared towards people who don't know Jesus. And the people who do know Jesus, for those of you who have been here for a while, you already know what I'm about to say. We will sacrifice more than anybody else. The people who have had a relationship with Jesus will sacrifice and set the example for what it looks like to sacrifice, so that people who are completely lost will have an opportunity to walk into a place and honestly get a good introduction to who Jesus is. I don't know what that looks like for me in 20 years. You know, if we reverse ourselves, if we go back in time a little bit and we go into the 90s, early 2000s, we had churches that were involved in these worship wars. It was like, well, which one are we going to do? And then for a moment, they were like, well, let's just do them together at the same time. And that just made everybody pissy, right? Like that's what was happening. I don't know what that is for me. Because right now, actually, my preference does align with the majority of folks that are lost in terms of what kind of music it is. It is actually my preference. But that will change. And there will be a moment when I go to bed at night and I'll say, you know what? Last Sunday was the last time we did things like this. And I hope my wife reminds me, don't ever become the person that doesn't sacrifice so that someone else can come to Jesus. Man, I hope that you remind me. That's what Jesus is doing with Peter. He's allowing him to know just how big of a job he has. And he gives it to Peter to help start the church, which he does just a few days from this conversation. On the day of Pentecost, the Holy Spirit comes. This movement is ignited. Fast forward about 2,000 years, and here we are today. Sacrifices must continue to be made so the church can flourish. What will we sacrifice? I think the first thing that we decided to sacrifice is that we would be a church plant that continues to plant churches. And so we made a commitment in our third month, right around our 13th week. And we committed $25,000 to another church plant in Griffin over the next 3 years. And I'm sure some people said, how are you committing funds that I'm still raising, that our people are still raising? All of our staff raise our salaries. What you put in the offering bucket doesn't cover our salaries. We go out and we raise it. And so people were saying, people actually didn't say it to me, but that thought might have been there in people's heads. How did you commit that much money when you haven't even finished raising the money for what we do here? Because that's going to be who we are. We will sacrifice some things to make sure that church gets off the ground, because there are people in Griffin who don't know Jesus. And so that means we've sacrificed the summer. Man, we would have loved to have food trucks every single Sunday afterwards. We've got them for 2. We love to make sure that every time a guest shows up, right, that if they really like our church, that they get t-shirts and hats and everything, that every Sunday we do that. We don't do that. We can't. We just do it periodically. We'd love to just write a check for Ruth Hill shoes to make sure every kid in that school has shoes to start the school year. Instead, we got to go out and bust our tails to raise more money through the golf tournament. We'll continue to make sacrifices to make sure the church can flourish. And that'll just be who we are. We are 6 months old today, and that's who we are today, and that's who we need to remain. We're thinking through things like, hey, how do we save seats for people who have never been to church before? Are we making sure that the sides and the backs are empty? That we move closer towards the front so that the people that show up for the first time and it's a little awkward, they can find a place that they're comfortable. That we're thinking through those details. That we're asking ourselves the question, can we serve? Can we pour in? Can we use our gifts? You know that when Jesus is talking to Peter, notice that he says, feed my sheep, take care of my lambs. You notice that Jesus specifically says, hey, this belongs to me. Just in case, Peter, you think that you're going to be some big shot that's going to run some program, you call it the church. Just in case that starts to seep into your head, I want you to remember, these belong to me. Foundation belongs to Jesus. Just in case anyone ever has any disagreement or argument, take it up with him. Foundation belongs to Jesus. It's his lambs, it's his sheep, it's his church. You know, one of my favorite things of this story, and I'm so grateful to be a part of this church here, and I can say that this is what we believe, that we're following Jesus. It will be hard for us to keep this as part of who we are. This will be difficult, but I'm so glad it is today. And that's this. It says, Jesus believes in grace and restoration. So should we. You see, Jesus could have taken this belligerent, loud-mouthed Peter and said, you know what? You stood up in front of all your friends and you guaranteed you wouldn't deny me. And then I told you exactly how many times you would and before you would, and you still said you wouldn't do it. And then you did. And you haven't come to me and said, hey, my bad, sorry about that, didn't mean to say that out loud, right? You hadn't done any of that. Jesus could have taken that time to say, you know what? I'm done with you. I'm done with your antics. I'm done with you speaking before you think. I'm done with you trying to lead all these people astray. I'm done with you setting a bad example. I'm done with you trying to be a leader and just leading people down the wrong way. He could have said, I'm done with you. But instead, Jesus says, I'll restore you, and I've got grace for you. Notice the pattern of restoration that Jesus puts in place. He sets aside a specific time. That it wasn't just a fly by the seat of his pants moment that I'll know when the moment's right. No, he said this is too important to let it linger on for the right moment to hopefully maybe occur. No, he set a specific time. He knew that Peter was coming in. He went to the beach. I don't know where he got the fish from. I don't know if he just said, hey, fishy, fishy, and he pulled it out. I don't know how that worked. But he got the fish. He started the fire. He's sitting there waiting on them. He was intentional about his time. Jesus then asked him questions that helped Peter arrive to the correct answer without Jesus simply saying, this is what's right and you're wrong. And I think this is my favorite part. After he extended grace to Peter, he also then extended an invitation. It wasn't just that I forgive you. Jesus was saying, because I know you'll be tempted to think that my words are also empty. Because I'm going to ask you in a minute, Jesus is thinking, I'm going to ask you in a minute, do you love me? And you're going to respond with words, and I'm going to tell you I need action. And so Jesus is modeling this for Peter. Listen to this. Jesus is modeling it for Peter when he says, hey, I'm going to forgive you. I'm going to forgive you. But then he's actually going to show action by inviting him into the story. Inviting him into more responsibility. Saying, I know you messed up. I know you did it in front of everyone. I know that there are going to be people that were there by the fire that when you have your big coming out party with the church, they're going to look and say, hold on, weren't you the guy that said you didn't know Jesus and now you're standing in front of everybody talking about how great Jesus is? Jesus knew all those things and still invited him in. Maybe that's where you're at this morning, where you feel like, okay, well, maybe Jesus will forgive me, but there's no chance God can use who I am. I think you're wrong. I think God can. I think God will.